In ancient times, man lived in a demon-infested world in which the fear of death was ever present. Fear is the most powerful force of our irrational mind, and it preyed upon our ancestors. They knew that if the rains did not come, crops would fail, and starvation would result. To appease the rain gods, the villagers would typically seek out a shaman or a witch doctor to increase their odds. The appointed mystic would then suggest a ritual of some kind, often involving a sacrifice. If these rituals were followed, the shaman assured the fearful farmers the rains would come. Has modern man really changed? We like to think we are so much wiser than our forebears, but are we really? The media-filled panic surrounding COVID-19 would seem to indicate that we are not. In both cases, although in ours monstrously amplified globally by the corporate press, an enormous fear was present. Like our ancestors, we sought out modern shamans in terms of public health officials to help us control the reign of COVID cases. We deified them and proceeded to follow whatever nonsense rituals they gave us. Were we ever following the science, or were we simply following the pseudo-religious rituals handed down to us by modern mystics? Consider the widely adopted health policy of masking in public restaurants. How does it make any scientific sense to wear a mask outside a restaurant, wear it inside, then take it off at a table? The virus is airborne, an aerosol. Why are you suddenly safe when you sit down? Does this sound like science or ritual? Or consider masking in general. Prior to COVID-19, the overwhelming consensus among doctors was that masks were next to useless for controlling a common respiratory pathogen such as COVID-19. Initially, our modern shamans acknowledged this, but the relentless media-induced fear of rising COVID cases forced them to come up with a new ritual, so they reversed themselves. As expected, masks have proven to be quite worthless, but they're quite effective as a virtue-signaling talisman. Does the mask reversal sound like our wise guardians of public health following the science, or shamans inventing further rituals because they cannot, in fact, control the rain? Finally, we have the vaccines, and the constant drumbeat to get everyone vaccinated. The data is overwhelming. The people who were most at risk to COVID-19 were those with compromised immune systems, typically the very old or those with severe comorbidities, the biggest being excess weight. As this is the case, and with vaccine rates above 80 and 90%, why the continued evangelism to get the vax? What exactly is the goal here? Does vaccinating 5-year-olds and zoo animals sound like science, or a ritual that has gone out of control? But what happens when the shaman's rituals fail to bring the promised results? The mystic cannot admit that his rituals were actually useless, as this would cost him his standing. Instead, he looks for someone to blame. He looks for a scapegoat. The reason his rituals failed were due to the presence of unbelievers in the group, and these apostates must be punished for their sin. The shaman's followers, still fear-driven and not willing to give up their faith, eagerly comply so they may maintain their hope. The scapegoats are driven from society. By doing this, the fearful masses pray, the rains will now come. Throughout history, minorities have often been punished for the failures and fears of a majority. The vaccines were promised by our modern mystics as a miracle that would end the pandemic. They did not. The rains did not come. The virus continued to virus, and case counts began to rise again. This necessitated our medical shamans to reinstate their previously failed policies, but they would need something more to protect their legitimacy. Like the charlatans of the past, they needed to find a scapegoat, and they found it in the unvaccinated. Ineffective and immoral vaccine passport systems were set up for the sole purpose of punishing the unvaccinated and excluding them from society. Does this sound scientific to you, or something much darker? Imagine you are looking at an old 1950s style computer with an unimaginable number of lights on it, each one representing a single aspect of what makes a healthy society function. Green lights indicate health, red does not. This computer is so complicated that it is impossible for any one person, or even a group, to fully understand what each light represents or how they interact. If the computer only measured economic indicators, it would be an excellent representation of why free markets work and central planning fails. However, this computer is not limited to economic measures like inflation or unemployment. It is also able to track things like depression, mental health, and happiness. It even monitors the trust citizens have in their major social institutions, such as the press, their medical and political establishments, and even the feelings they have for each other. Our Western leadership classes, responding to the fear generated by the corporate media, have been focused on the one red light of the everything computer marked COVID cases at the expense of everything else. The result of this unscientific, myopic obsession on this single vector, which they were never able to control, is that almost every other light on the everything computer is now blinking red. This indicates a leadership class that is out of touch with the people they govern, and a society that is ripe for a populist backlash of historic proportions. The American experiment with prohibition is the closest analogy we have to a public policy failure on the scale of COVID-19. Back then, the single variable on the everything computer that our elites tried to stamp out was alcohol consumption. Then, like now, the science was led by politicians and the media, with academics leading from behind to support the policy after the fact. Then, like now, anyone who opposed or even questioned the establishment narrative were made outcast from their professions and often smeared as secret drunks, bootlegging shills, or, worst of all, not following the science. Although it took 13 years, prohibition was eventually broken by the sheer nonsense of the policy, the increasing non-compliance of citizens, as well as the unintended consequences that it created. What is interesting is that the leadership classes of that time did not suffer any repercussions for the disastrous policies they pushed so vehemently. They were able to get away with this as there was no internet and it was far easier to sweep bad decisions down the memory hole. I do not believe this will be the case this time. With modern technology, everything our elites said and did can be remembered. Some in our leadership classes seem to be aware of this, hence the push for censorship and a public freakout over Elon Musk's Twitter purchase. I suspect these efforts will ultimately fail as it is impossible to hide the truth forever. Institutions that must rely on censorship do so out of weakness, not strength. I see a mammoth populist backlash building throughout the Western world, and try as they might, our various leaders and their supporters will not be able to hide from the things they've done. The video you have just watched is based on a book I am currently writing. Its goal is to understand the psychology behind our elite's disastrous response to COVID. I have a full-time job at the moment, so I am working on it part-time, but I am making progress. If you wish to encourage me and read what I have written so far in rough draft form, sign up for my COVID Red Pill email list below. As I add and expand the book, I intend to send it out to this list in order to gain feedback. We need to understand the forces that cause this worldwide public policy disaster so that we can prevent it from happening again. With your help, I hope my little book can be a piece of that puzzle.